The keto diet and its potential to cure schizophrenia. I've just watched Cody's video on this, Cody Green. If you're not familiar with Cody, check him out. He's on my recommended YouTube channels footer at the bottom of my channel page. He makes great content. He's very good at demarcating the limits of his knowledge, and he's very good at saying, this is where I'm coming from. I'm not coming from this position. I'm not coming from that position. This is my take on it. And we need more of that in mental health discourse online. His video is about reacting to RFK Jr.'s claims, and I'm not based in the States, and I don't know anything about RFK Jr. other than what I've seen on Twitter, which is people saying that he's prone to bad health takes that don't necessarily correspond to our understanding of the evidence. That's all I know. So I'm not going to talk about RFK Jr., but I am going to talk about how the keto diet has been all over the internet for the last probably year, as far as I can remember, as like, this is the thing, guys. If you've got schizophrenia and you're tired of the side effects of antipsychotics, you need to go on keto. Now, I've been on the keto diet, not as a treatment for schizophrenia, just because I was interested. I've tried intermittent fasting, I've tried all sorts of shit to try and be less overweight, which is something that people on antipsychotics may investigate, because weight gain on antipsychotics is a pain in the ass. And you get to a point, or at least I got to a point where I was like, I'll try anything just to try and slim down a bit. And I didn't notice any improvement in my residual symptoms as a result of doing that. That's my personal experience. But in terms of like the research I've read on the keto diet, there are some published papers out there that have done some experimental work where they've given people with schizophrenia a ketogenic diet, and they've done pre and post surveys on the PAN score and stuff like that. I will link to some of those, but it's very preliminary research, and we're talking tiny samples of like 10 people. This stuff doesn't necessarily generalize, and you've got to think with studies like this about things like placebo effects. And with such a tiny sample, quantitative work with samples that small is only really beneficial as a case study or a case report. It's not actually usable as quantitative evidence. The studies are underpowered statistically. You can't draw any population level conclusions from that. You can't extrapolate or generalize. So there is preliminary evidence, and the area is being investigated, and the gut microbiome research that Cody talks about is interesting, the relationship between gut-brain health and that sort of thing. But schizophrenia is more complicated than the gut microbiome alone. Schizophrenia is a serious neuropsychiatric syndrome characterized by severe symptoms, right? We're not talking about mood, which is responsive to lifestyle changes to some degree. But even in the case of mood disorders, lifestyle alone isn't going to treat, severe depression or catatonia or mood disorders or any of those things, right? What you're looking at really are potentially small beneficial effects that are a potential adjunct to the main treatment pathway or arm, right? But I do follow the gut microbiome research. I think it's interesting. There's also a line of research on inflammation in schizophrenia and the role of inflammation. Again, I think a lot of these researchers are siloing. So you've got the inflammation camp saying schizophrenia is an inflammation problem. And then you've got the genetics researchers saying we're looking for risk markers, genetic risk markers. About 8 years ago, there was a study going on at Oxford about looking for a blood biomarker for schizophrenia that could be picked up in a blood test. I never followed what that study found. I'll go look it up after this. But the fact that I haven't heard about it suggests that they might not have found it. But because they're quite siloed, because academic fields are siloed, they're not really tapping into the problem in the way that it needs to be tapped into, which is interdisciplinarily. Like, schizophrenia is likely the result of things like genetic vulnerability, neurodevelopmental insult, obstetric complications which may feed into the inflammation angle, adverse life events, trauma, and then in the case of my research, linguistic insults. If you're surrounded by people who are abusive to you, that has a neuroplastic effect. Okay? Which, obviously the environment affects the body affects the engagement with the environment and the perception of the environment. It's like a bidirectional feedback loop. So if you're genetically and neurodevelopmentally and obstetrically vulnerable, and then you go into a situation where you grow up in poverty with abusive parents and you're bullied at school and sexually abused, guess what's going to happen? All of those vulnerabilities are going to combine, and your odds of developing schizophrenia are profoundly increased. So the tendency for people to say it's all gut microbiome, it's all inflammation, it's all genetics, they're barking up the wrong tree. And then of course schizophrenia is heterogeneous. So there are multiple syndromes. The most important line from my PhD thesis is the one in the beginning in trying to define schizophrenia, and it says it's unclear whether schizophrenia is a syndrome that points to a single disorder or a family of disorders that resembles a syndrome. That's the current state of our understanding of schizophrenia. So given that, it's very silly to say that there's a cure for schizophrenia, because we're talking about schizophrenias most likely. And one cure won't address all of them. So now back to the keto diet. What I do want to say though is I've actually forgotten what the keto diet is. Is it low carb? I can't remember. But what I have found is low carb is good for not the symptoms of schizophrenia, but the side effects of antipsychotics. When I'm taking antipsychotics, if I load up on carbs, I feel like shite. But if I go slightly lower on the carbs, the sluggishness, the sedation, not as profound, right? If I have a couple of beers and a big loaf of bread on antipsychotics, I feel a hell of a lot worse than if I have a salad and some protein. That is the extent of my contribution on diet in schizophrenia, is that my experience has been that the side effects of antipsychotics are amplified by high carb consumption. That's all I have to say experientially on diet and anything to do with my experience of mental health. I haven't noticed, much like Cody's experience, I haven't noticed any significant change in my symptomatology from the keto diet. What I'm trying to illustrate there is that I think there might be a grain of truth in the idea that diet can be assistive for people with a serious mental illness. Dietary changes may be beneficial for optimizing medication tolerance or optimizing medication efficacy, that sort of thing. But that's very different from the claim that a diet cures a condition like schizophrenia, or a cluster of conditions like the schizophrenias, right? So I just wanted to make that video. I mean, Cody's already nails it, but I'm making this one pretty much basically to just throw that thing out there about beer and bread. Like, you don't want to load up on carbs if you're on antipsychotics, in my experience. You might have a very different experience. You might, put a ton of carbs away and be absolutely fine. But my personal experience was that, and I imagine it has something to do with dopaminergic suppression, because dopamine isn't just in the brain. Right, it's in the pancreas, it's in all kinds of other places, and that's where you get the metabolic syndrome, the type 2 diabetes onset, the physical health complications of long-term antipsychotic use. And I'm not saying that or referencing them to say medication is bad. but we can't pretend that those aren't real consequences of long-term antipsychotic maintenance therapy. And I've written a paper on this for Schizophrenia Bulletin about how it's an agonizing trade-off. You know, my experience of maintenance therapy is basically I have to physically disintegrate in order that I can be more tolerable for the people around me. That's how I perceive maintenance therapy. Society can't put up with me when I'm not on medication, so I have to physically disintegrate for their comfort. It's a highly pessimistic take, but that's, in my core, that's how I feel. On the flip side of that, I feel much better psychiatrically when I'm on medication. It really does benefit me. And you might find, if you compare the videos I made when the channel first started, when I was off medication, to the videos I'm making now, you'll notice that I'm thinking slower, I'm speaking slower, I'm emotionally flatter, but I'm probably a little bit softer and more measured at the same time. So, yeah, I think diet is helpful as an adjunct, but it is not a replacement for treatment. Diet is not a treatment, in my opinion, for serious mental illness. It is a way of optimizing extraneous variables, right? But it's not as significant as the experimental variable, right? So, yeah, just my little piece on that.